Good evening. Welcome, everyone, this evening to the Pastora San Juan Cafferty lecture on race and ethnicity in American life. I'm Neil Guterman. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you tonight to what I think promises to be a very exciting lecture. I would, as I'm opening up, I just would like to express some mixed emotion about tonight specifically. Because this is the first year that we will hold the lecture without Pastora San Juan Cafferty, whom many of you know. Pastora, of course, passed away after a long struggle with cancer. And so I personally am sad, of course, that Pastora is not able to be with us here tonight. I got to know Pastora during the tail end of her life, as I came into the dean role about 3 and some odd years ago. And although that was a short amount of time, in that brief period, I felt like I got to know Pastora and that quickly we became good friends. Those of you that know Pastora, she was a real people person and a connector, and she, in great Pastora style, when my appointment to the deanship was announced, she immediately emailed me, like many people did, and said, "Congratulations." But then she also said, "Let's get together." Right? And then so we got together over lunch. And those of you who know Pastora, you're laughing because you know her. We had this lovely lunch for 2.5 hours. And she welcomed me into the dean role. She helped give me some advice. She helped me connect up to people. She told lots of stories, and I listened. And I learned an enormous amount from her in just a short amount of time. And I felt like this is a friend, that not many people have. And on the other hand, she has friendships and relationships with so many of you here in the city. For those of you that didn't know her, Pastora, first and foremost, was a connector, as I said. She was a total people person, and she was really a civic citizen in the city in the greatest sense. She was fiercely devoted to the School of Social Service Administration, to the University of Chicago, and the city of Chicago. And like the School of Social Service Administration, Pastora was dedicated to going and taking on the most difficult of community and social issues. And she did so with enormous intellectual energy, with enormous integrity, balancing great vision with on-the-ground people connectedness and love of people and humility. And so tonight's event is really one especially befitting of Pastora's legacy. The spirit of the event is not that we just hold a lecture at the Mies building in Hyde Park or some other university building, rather that we come to the center of the city of Chicago and we talk about the most complicated issues facing the city in a civic forum where we can meet one another, where we can talk with one another, and where we can learn from some great scholars. Excuse me. As Pastora, you may know, was a professor at the school for 33 years before her retirement, and she focused her scholarship on the issue of ethnicity from a very multi-layered, multifaceted viewpoint, and she held particular interest in Latino diversity and its intersections with social and political institutions, public and private sectors. And like so much of the great scholarship that comes out of the School of Social Service Administration, Pastora's work didn't shy away from taking on deep challenges facing our community. She brought enormous intellectual energy and focused in a way that tangibly made a difference and helped to advance the city of Chicago and urban areas beyond. In 2005, on the occasion of Pastora's retirement from SSA, Pastora's civic, business, and academic colleagues established an endowment in her honor that supports this event this evening. And I would just like to take a moment to thank them the members of the Cafferty Civic Lecture Committee for their work in putting forward tonight's event and our events annually. That's William Brodsky, Frank Clark, Jeanne Marsh, Alan McNally, and Linda Johnson Rice, as well as the corporations that helped to make the Pastora Cafferty Endowment possible. That's the Exelon Corporation, Waste Management Incorporated, People's Energy, Kimberly-Clark, the CBOE, and Harris Bank. So, befitting Pastora, who is such a connector, tonight I think represents, those of you here in the audience represent what Pastora was about, which is we have university members, we have business leaders, we have civic leaders, we have members of social services agencies, we have our alums. It's an event that brings it all together in the best tradition of Pastora. So I would like to say one point of connecting us together is that although Pastora herself is no longer able to be with us tonight, I'm really touched and pleased that Pastora's brother, Rafael San Juan, is here this evening. And we're so glad that you're able to be with us. And we continue to be joined with you in sadness. I know you and I chatted just before, because it is a very difficult loss for many of us. And we hope that this annual event will continue in perpetuity and continue to uplift and connect us in her honor and in her memory. So I'm so glad you're here. Okay, so now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Sudhir Venkatesh, the William Ransford Professor of Sociology and the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University in New York City. We're especially delighted to welcome Sudhir back to Chicago and the University of Chicago, where he did his doctoral work in sociology and began his career in Chicago as what he calls, I'm using your term, a rogue sociologist. The term rogue, I looked it up because I wasn't exactly sure what we might mean by that term. And one of the meanings, there are multiple meanings, thankfully, but one of the meanings is, pressing beyond the normal and accepted boundaries of behavior. And Sudhir's first rogue work in Chicago tells us of his deep experiences and insights in the urban underground in Chicago, and particularly with experiences with a street gang in the then Robert Taylor Homes. This work is chronicled in his now, it's no exaggeration to say, classic and seminal work, an eye-opening work, and one of the few intellectual works that becomes a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list, Gang Leader for a Day. Sudhir has since written several other works, and he's received numerous honors for his work on urban life and the urban underground. And his most recent work, Floating City, focuses now on the New York City underground economy, providing an interesting parallax and expansion to his experiences and insights developed in Chicago. Tonight's presentation is entitled Chicago's Big Short, Selling the Myth of Integration in the American City, where Sudhir will share with us his uniquely informed observations on Chicago's public housing transformation. Will you please join me in warmly welcoming Sudhir back to Chicago to speak with us tonight?
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be chosen to represent the lectureship this year, particularly at a time where there's a lot of remembrance. What I'd like to do really is to talk to you a little bit about, read a little bit from a forthcoming book that I'm writing about Chicago public housing. And since this is alumni weekend, et cetera, I'd let you have some homework, and it's very simple, which is that I'd like to know when you think of public housing, what that means, because it's not something that we can look at everywhere in the city as we once could. So I'm curious, if we happen to talk later, if you just tell me what that kind of images it brings to your mind. As I said, I'm just going to read a little bit, and then hopefully we'll have a chance to engage each other in a conversation in about 30 minutes or so. On a breezy night in Manhattan, I received a phone call from an angry gang member who had just been released from jail. He said I needed to make him happy, or else. When you study urban street gangs, the last thing you want to hear from a gang leader is or else. But John Henry Richardson, Fatman, to his friends, was not fooling around. Listen, Fatman said, I just got out. 7 years, I just got out of jail, and I'm in the projects, and I'm looking for you. I had no idea what I did to upset him. In fact, I thought John Henry Richardson, Fatman to his friends, was dead. Being a scientist, I decided to gather evidence. Before we go too far, I said, whoever this really is, and if this really is Fatman, well, how do I know that you're not dead? Excuse me, are you saying that I'm not who I'm saying I am? I had him. The Fatman I knew many years ago was a troublemaker, a gang leader, thug, professional crack dealer. If he was getting out of jail, what would be his plan? I wondered. After all, his public housing community, Robert Taylor Homes, was being demolished. Yes, that's right, I said, standing up a little straighter. I mean, how do I know it's really you, if you're dead, I mean? Well, if it's not me calling you, my brother, who is it then? Well, that's what I'm saying, I said. If you're dead, then who's calling me? If I was dead, how could I call you? Exactly, I said. I now had the imposter in my cold little hands. Listen, let me tell you what I'm calling you for, Fatman said, not interested in our Abbott and Costello routine. And then he started talking about me and my research. I was studying families moving from the Robert Taylor homes. Fatman wanted me to pay him for the right to interview these families. I want you to come to Chicago, he said, and settle this, or I'm coming to New York after you, and we're going to talk, just you and me. Talk. Another thing you don't want to hear from a powerful street gang member is I'd like to talk. Talk show host, they're not. Look, he said, I'll put it to you like this. If you're talking to families, you're interviewing them, well, I need to get paid. Fatman may have sounded a little crazy, but he was right. I had to have permission from somebody to get into the housing developments, whether it was a gang, a cop, a preacher. There was always somebody vouchsafing my presence. And then I knew exactly what was happening. The projects were coming down, and Fatman had to relocate, just like the families. What a great natural experiment, I thought. I told Fatman I'd be there in a few days. He said he'd be waiting. Tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about Fatman and his community, public housing. They're still caught in the middle of a wonderful pilot program in America. At a time when the nation is divided between big government and small government, Chicago is trying a new approach, smart government, relying on the private sector. No more of big centralized projects like Robert Taylor that segregate the poor. The new plan is to integrate the poor, sprinkle them around in neighborhoods using the private market. Let the private market work its magic. Everyone in America is watching. 4 years into the plan was where I want to begin this story. Integration was getting mixed reviews. On TV, single mothers in the suburbs were smiling, very happy. But 90% of relocating families were still in Chicago, and they were moving to other minority and poor neighborhoods. Why was this happening? What factors were causing this? Those were matters for sociologists, city pundits, and of course lakefront liberals who had the comfort and privilege to attend to them. Right now, I had a bigger problem, and that was Fatman. So our story begins 8 a.m., August 1st, 2003, in Robert Taylor. Peering out of her stained window, Lulu Masters was nervous and excited to see the moving van. Unlike so many of her neighbors, she wanted to get out. Unlike so many of her neighbors, she wanted to leave the projects. After 30 years, her whole life, she was dying to leave. She was one of 4,000 families about to leave. She ran down the stairs and she met the drivers who were uncomfortable and nervous, but for different reasons. 2 of the movers had just been beaten. 6 had been robbed in the past month by the local gang, a gang run by Lulu's boyfriend who was, guess who? Fatman. Rumor was Fatman's crew was now looking for more movers to harass and rob, and Lulu did her best to put the movers at ease. Don't worry, she said. I know Fatman. You'll be safe. Oh, Lord Sudhir, she almost started to cry. I have no time to waste. Moving day is here. I'm going to leave these projects. Scowling and scared, the movers rode up with her in a rickety, urine-stained elevator up to her apartment. I knew every item on Lulu's list that morning that she was going to move. It was not how you and I would probably move. First, she had to pay Miss Maple, the tenant leader, $50 to make sure that Lulu's moving van didn't accidentally get lost, at which point she'd have to pay Miss Maple $250 to find her belongings. Next, she'd have to pay her landlord $100 because he had to pay $500 to the Section 8 inspector to pass the inspection of his faulty unit. Then after that, it was a bribe to a city worker who promised to find her disabled son a spot in an after-school program in her new neighborhood. The cost, $100. And on it went. This is one of the reasons she wanted to leave, these petty taxes. But where am I going to find the cash, Lulu wondered. I have to do it today. She had $18 in her pocket. The obvious answer was Fatman. The gang leader had offered her $500 if he could move into her new place in Auburn Gresham. This meant keeping his guns and drugs in her house, though, which she didn't want to do. "I can't go back to Fatman," she said. "I just can't. I need a new life." 9 a.m. "Hey, Lulu, looks like your moving van is here." It was Miss Maple, the tenant leader. "You know, Lulu, I didn't believe you when you said you wanted to help others get out before you did. Well, I thought, well, Lulu must think of herself as a fancy social worker. Guess I was wrong about you, Lulu. Guess you were right after all. You got a big heart." Mrs. Maple was sarcastic, but she was right about one thing. Lulu and her mother did help people to leave the housing developments, the most vulnerable people. You could multiply Lulu's predicament across the Robert Taylor homes, and she was helping many people. She helped a nervous, shaky Millie Morgan to move safely to South Shore with her 4 children. Lulu's mother found Millie a job at Target, and she helped Millie's son exit Fatman's gang. Then she found an affordable home for her friend Katrina and her 5 children. Then, for Papa Darrell, the old disabled codger who filled the role of her adopted grandfather, she found an affordable room in a senior citizen's home. And on it went. When the housing authority in the city couldn't help the families, there was Lulu, there was Lulu's mother. Right now, Lulu needed to find money. She needed the money to pay off Miss Maple and her landlord, the relocation counselor, and so on. $335 was standing in front of Lulu and her new home. $335. If she didn't get it, she'd have to move her family to a shelter where life was nasty, brutish, and short. "Hope you can come and see me by the end of the day," Ms. Maple said sinisterly. Lulu knew exactly what that meant. If the moving man left the building and Miss Maple and the landlord and others were not paid, Lulu would risk losing her belongings, her apartment, and her dreams. Where would she get the money that most Chicagoans probably had in their pocket? That was Lulu's question. But for the city, the transformation of public housing raises 2 other questions. First, was there still a social contract that held Chicago together once these places came down? What was our obligation as Chicagoans to the Lulus of the world? Second, why is there an inherent irrationality built into our municipal social policies? Herbs and hortos, so our Chicago's crest says, but gardens and beautiful tree-lined medians along Lakeshore for the wealthy, while crumbling violence infests neighborhoods that welcome the poor. From 2000 onwards, 80% of the gun violence in Chicago has been concentrated in 25% of its communities, all of which are minority and poor. Chicago continues to be a tale of 2 cities, one a theme park, the other the murder capital of America, as one newspaper just said. But why I love this city is that Chicagoans never stop searching for the social contract that ties these 2 cities together. So how can we rebuild that today? And the answer I want to suggest, or part of that answer, is to watch Lulu and her neighbors and watch Lulu and the people involved in this public housing experiment do their magic. Let me get back to this story. 10 a.m. I left Lulu and the movers to visit Fatman, who had gathered his gang in a South Side park. The demolition of Robert Taylor meant that his gang also lost their home and several $100,000 per year in crack cocaine sales. But finding a new marketplace was not so easy for Fatman. It meant he had to take over the gang in a neighboring neighborhood. These were usually violent affairs. The start of the process was very simple. Find a tenant who was moving and who would let you store the guns, drugs, and cash in their apartment. After that, he could overtake the local gang and control the local market himself. He didn't need the tenants anymore. The problem was the tenants were saying no to Fatman and his merger and acquisition strategy. So with time running out and only a few dozen families left in the building, he was hoping for Lulu. He promised her $500 a month, and he offered to take care of all the bribes she needed to pay if she let him bring guns and drugs and cash with him. Lulu said no, not a chance, but Fatman was undeterred. "Lulu will come back crying to me," he told me. "They always do, see, Sudhir, they always do. The project is simple. The families who can't leave all need my money." Just like that. It's always money that makes people do things. Only money, really. Fatman's theory was like Freakonomics in the ghetto. His theory of incentives reminded me of an old football saying by a New York Giants general manager: when they tell you it's not about the money, it's about the money. 12:30 p.m. In another part of the city, in downtown at the CHA headquarters, I'm sitting watching a bunch of faxes come out of the fax machine, Hum, whiz, plop, hum, whiz, plop. They make a soft pile on the dirty gray carpet, and I do my best to try to read what's on the faxes. Minzy Development Company, Presidio Real Estate, West Lawn Properties. Looks like you came just in time, Melissa shouts from behind the desk, watching me. Oh, sorry, I said. I didn't mean to look. They just come out so quickly. Welcome to my life, Melissa twirled around, effortlessly bending over to pick up the faxes. I don't get paid enough. Don't forget these, as her assistant Joni ran into the room with even more faxes. I wasn't supposed to be here. Melissa Hannerty and her staff were charged with relocating 25,000 families from the project safely and without incident. A director's office at the CHA was off limits to outsiders, especially sociologists. But here I was. The early reviews of Melissa's work in the CHA were poor, to say the least. HUD once again threatened to place the CHA in receivership. Melissa needed help, and I felt badly for her. Melissa was Chicago Irish, from the mayor's Bridgeport neighborhood. She left a fancy corporate job for the housing authority, hoping to gain credentials for a spirited political career. But after just 1 year, she lost her optimism. I don't get paid enough, she would mutter. I wanted to tell her about Lili's problems. I wanted Melissa to stop Ms. Maple from extorting Lulu. I wanted her to help the other 76 families find a new home before time ran out. But all she wanted to do was talk about these damn faxes. She threw the faxes in front of me. Each one of these pages is a donor, she instructed me like a high school teacher, to the mayor, to the aldermen, to state senators. Well, how much do they give to the campaigns, I asked. No idea, I just know what they get in return. Oh, I said knowingly. You fill their apartments up with the relocating families, don't you? Well, great timing, because I have a few who could really use a place to live right now. Not that easy, she muttered. We're not allowed to help them, her assistant interrupted. Well, not yet, anyway. First, they need to get kicked out of the projects, out of the whole process, actually. They need to screw up. Then we can help them. I was lost. What the hell was she talking about so anxiously? Kicked out of the projects, out of the whole process? Adjusting her wire rims, her assistant continued earnestly. See, when families fail to move like they should, we call them non-compliant. At that point, they become emergency cases, which means we can put them wherever we like. Get it? And if they're emergencies, Melissa winked at me, well, then we can put them in the apartments on the faxes. See, Sudhir, that's how we solve problems around here. But you can't just put them in the apartments now, I said, and give them a home? No, Melissa said, laughing. Don't you get it, Sudhir? What does a PhD from the University of Chicago actually get you? Good question, I coughed. I wanted to remind her I also had a master's from the U of C, but so did she. Listen, Sudhir, my kindergartner can understand this. Here's how it works. The lawyers won't let us give these nice apartments to tenants. They'll sue us if we do. So first, we remove families off the public housing rolls. But to do that, they need to screw up, be non-compliant. Don't you get it? Melissa looked over to Joni. This really makes no sense, I said, not understanding. I looked at the faxes. The apartments were so affordable, $400 or $500 a month, and right here on the south side. They were perfect. They were in wonderful African-American neighborhoods. Then it hit me. I get it, I sighed. How depressing. Yeah, depressing. Took you about 10 minutes to figure it out, Melissa said. And now that I saw it, the logic was so simple, even elegant in a sick way. Number one, on paper, Chicago's experiment was to use federal money to remove families from the projects, integrate neighborhoods, and then rebuild the project lands for the middle class. Simple. Number two, but the city's public interest lawyers threatened to sue the housing authority and the city if they moved black families to black neighborhoods, even if the families wanted to live there, because that was segregation. So to avoid a lawsuit, Melissa and the city had to integrate families into white middle-class neighborhoods. Number three, but affordable housing in white middle-class neighborhoods was in short supply. The landlords there were disinclined to rent to people from public housing. And frankly, not all families wanted to end up in the burbs. Solution? Number four, find a way, legal or not, to relocate the families into black neighborhoods where, as it happened, landlords actually wanted them. The CHA staff had come up with a creative idea. Drag their feet until each family became an emergency, and move the families into the slums to which they seemed destined, a solution that was simple, elegant, and illegal as hell. Integration be damned. This was no longer about principle. It was about bureaucracy. It was about a city that works. Social work meets the innovation economy. Both Mark Zuckerberg and Lulu would have been proud. Sudhir, listen, Melissa said patronizingly, I'm happy to help your families, but you need to understand that helping is not something that looks like it does in the nice middle-class neighborhoods that you and I live in. Here, helping is dealing with crap before it explodes. Don't let today's problems become tomorrow's crisis. That's the rule that I live by. If a few donors get rich off it, who cares? It's not my problem. Then she sighed and led me to the door. I don't get paid enough, she muttered, and said goodbye. I headed back to the projects, my head ringing. When they tell you it's not about the money, it's about the money. I couldn't help think back to all the wonderful books that I read in my poverty classes in graduate school, how to use incentives, how to build social policy that mattered, promoting public-private entrepreneurship. Few books mentioned the inner workings of government where the sausage of social policy seemed to be made. I'll admit, watching Melissa wasn't pretty, but in a way it was one of the most beautiful things I had seen as a sociologist. This was democracy at work, in her own way. Melissa and Lulu both shared a vision of the social contract. They were committed to making things work. Which brings us to lesson number 1. Be careful not to let the government get in the way of governing. Procedures sometimes do little more than get in our way. This is something that the public interest lawyers couldn't understand. They wanted poor families to they wanted poor families to separate from one another. The problem was that the poor didn't organize their lives as mother, parent, and 2 children. They lived in networks of sharing and support. One family didn't move alone. 10 families moved together. But policy made by middle-class folks created unrealistic expectations. It forced Melissa and the CHA to improvise, adapt, and use highly illegal means to keep the machine moving. The irrationality was not that they were acting improperly. No, the irrationality was that we were building a system that made such behavior the only reasonable choice. Empathy and innovation would cost Melissa and her staff a job if they were caught, whereas they should be rewarded for not putting the poor on the streets. Back to our story, 2 p.m. The movers struggled to put Lulu's blackish faux leather sectional in their small truck. She could hear them joke about the permanent impression her backside had made in the center cushion, and she was upset. She wanted to tell them that the couch helped her to become an employed single mom. Not a crack user. She studied on that couch. She passed her tax preparer's exam on that couch. But before she could speak, a shot rang out, then another gunshot. Everyone get down, Lulu yelled. She quickly shooed her kids inside the building. She yelled at the teenagers to cover up the little ones on the ground, and then she shouted to the movers, stay calm, get inside, and don't poop in your pants because I got nothing for you to wear. She had come so far, nothing was going to stop her now. Her sister Dory just kept standing out in the open, cigarette in hand, as if nothing was happening. Oh, nothing to worry about, she said. Fatman's just trying to intimidate the movers, that's all. Dory was right. The shots were fired by a gang member who worked for Fatman. He wanted to scare away the moving vans. Bad for business. And boy, did it work. 2 of the vans started pulling out and driving away the belongings of the residents coming out of the back. Lulu looked around and sighed in relief that her van was still there. While these dramas were taking place inside the building, something remarkable was taking place outside. A rich white man was standing in the middle of the street in the steamy August heat, trying to help the poor project dwellers by directing traffic. This was Milton Carter, who was part of the development team in charge of demolishing and rebuilding the lands. Carter was a curiosity. Most developers stayed far away, cool in their suburban offices. After all, their responsibility was to tear the place down, not act as therapists to disenfranchise black folk. But Carter was out there alone and fearless, waving his hands at the movers and directing traffic, and gang members and residents alike, an astonishing sight. I caught him trying to persuade Miss Mabel not to ask for tenants for a bribe on the day that they were moving out. She wasn't budging, however. I had spent dozens of hours with Carter. He lost sleep at night worrying that Chicago's grand experiment to transform public housing wouldn't work. The worry turned Carter into an evangelist. Close your eyes, he would say to small and big crowds alike. 10 years, this place will be unlike anything you've seen. No more blight, no more fear, just 2 miles of grassy lawns and playgrounds. You'll think you were in Winnetka. As we know, to Chicagoans, God still lives in Winnetka. But as the plan went off the rails, the media began blaming Carter. They let the mayor off the hook because he was too powerful, and everyone's expectations of the CHA was way too low anyway. But the media loved going after the money-grubbing developers. So Carter did the same thing that Melissa and Lulu and Lulu's mother were doing: find solutions. Tenants usually made fun of Carter, saying he was a drug user who came to the projects, developed amnesia, forgot what he was supposed to be buying, and just decided to hang around. But they appreciated his passion for their welfare. A family's hot water failed, Carter would get into a hour-long spat with the local maintenance crew. He made sure that the new landlords complied with safety codes. He was just one more person working off the books to make this bureaucratic elephant fly. As Carter and I talked, Ms. Maple came over to us and began talking to Lulu. Lulu, you need to get these moving vans out of here. I told you you had 4 hours to move. We got other tenants waiting. Carter was here just in time today. Not only was Ms. Maple in need of her bribe, but Lulu's landlord was also waiting for his payoff. Capitalism was in high gear. The landlord had been calling Lulu all day, hinting that Lulu may find her home padlocked, surprisingly, if she didn't come up with $100. This drove Lulu nearly to tears. Where am I going to put my stuff? She yelled on the phone to her landlord. Where am I going to sleep? Lulu's sister shook her head. Damn it, Lulu, I told you to call Fatman. He would have visited that landlord and Ms. Maple. He would have paid everyone for you. You know, you can't do everything yourself, Lulu. No way, Lulu said. I'm starting my life fresh without that thug. And then she covered her face with her hand and she slid onto the floor in tears. Fatman doesn't want anything but what's best for himself, she moaned. I just want to get out of here. If you could see my new apartment. I know, you told me 200 times, her sister said. New bathroom, kitchen as big as your ass. No, Dory. I said kitchen as big as your ass. Dory laughed. Okay, don't worry. You'll get there, don't worry. And just then, Carter, the developer, strode in. He picked up the phone and called Melissa at the CHA. His objective was to get Miss Maple off Lulu's back. Hi, Melissa, this is Carter. We have a real problem here. Ms. Maple is your employee, not mine. She works for the CHA. She wants each of the tenants moving to pay $50 today, and there's 10 of them that are moving. So what if you give her $250 and I give her the rest? What do you say? Let's spare the families. Can you find some change in petty cash? Okay, good. That's great. Thank you. Carter turned to Lulu. Okay, one problem solved, Lulu. Don't give up any hope, okay? Not today. And he walked off to the next crisis. There was still the landlord to deal with, and time was running out for Lulu. Which brings us to lesson number 2. The story of race and class in our cities is often told as black versus white, Latino versus black, Latino versus white, and so on. But Carter and Melissa, two rich and powerful whites, and the black families in the project were dancing an intricate ballet together. Were they the same? Of course not. But both obeyed one core principle, which is that daily life for public goods ruthlessly followed the laws of the market. I don't mean the rational choice markets where everyone is optimizing their preferences. I mean the market of debt, where everyone owes somebody something and everyone is owed something. The markets where debt creates relationships of trust and intimacy and belonging. Any trader knows this. Indeed, every trader, whether on an exchange or in a bazaar, follows this simple rule. Being in the game means owing somebody and being owed. For most poor families, it's no different, just a different market, that's all. When Carter and Melissa help Lulu deal with Miss Maple, they know Lulu will help them in return. The currency of transactions in city government doesn't give a damn about black and white. You're a trader, pure and simple. That's what has made Chicago great since the 1800s, deal-making. And now to the end of the day and the end of our story. 6 p.m., Minister Bookman arrives at his church with a police officer, Reggie Wharton. They were both here to see Fatman. The gang leader had just beaten up Lulu's landlord in an effort to help Lulu move successfully. The landlord was now in the Roseland Hospital, getting stitches and ready to call the police. Fatman had hoped this generous action would help Lulu make Lulu more willing to accept him, but in reality, it just made things worse. Lulu could now be seen as an accessory to assault. He's afraid of losing everything, Officer Reggie lamented. The only thing Fatman knows is the projects and killing. Fatman needs to slow down. Brother has no sense of foreplay, the minister smirked. Which makes me wonder how he has so many kids. Reggie laughed. Funny, I heard them say the same thing about you, minister. Officer Reggie said that Fatman's crew had beaten up 5 landlords in the last 2 weeks. They were seeking a reduced rent for tenants. In return for this generous negotiation, he would make the residents hide the gang's drugs and guns and cash in their apartment. Minister and Officer Reggie needed to quickly calm down Fatman before he kept on his tirade of violence and negotiation. In the last few years, Minister Bookman had developed a specialty for the Fatmans of Chicago. The minister was known as the man who helped communities deal with the gangs coming from the projects. In normal times, Minister's ability to crisscross mainstream and underworld would have been viewed as a strength and a good one. But these were hardly normal times. Ground zero was a stretch from Auburn, Gresham down to Roseland. Gunfire in schools, drive-by shootings, you've heard it all. The police feel overwhelmed by the wave of violence and people are afraid to walk the streets, except for the minister and the other so-called interrupters. Even if unjustified, this rising chorus of local anger blames the relocating public housing tenants for all these problems. They are the easy targets. So the minister is also embedded in a logic of the market. He earns hundreds of thousands of dollars in foundation support, which makes him the envy of all of these nonprofits in the city. But that means that on this late afternoon, with Fatman doing his thing, the funders expect the minister to find a solution. Fatman was getting more and more desperate as the date of the closing of his building nears. The minister and Officer Reggie needed to shut down the gang leader, or at least slow him down a little bit. Ironically, the minister came to his pastoral calling from the streets. He was once a very unremarkable gang member himself. He didn't drink, swear, or shoot straight. Joining was a response to boredom and peer pressure. He tagged along during an escapade in which 4 friends robbed a liquor store. His mother, a clerk at Cook County Hospital, asked the local police commander for a favor. A few hours later, the arresting officer mysteriously could no longer properly recall if there was a 5th accomplice. Bookman was released. On the bus ride home, his mother made her son an offer he couldn't refuse. I helped you avoid jail, now you're going to the Army. 5 years in the service and a brief stint in the seminary under his belt, Teddy Bookman had found the straight and the narrow. The minister never forgot the attractions of the life, nor did he sever his connections to those who still walked that way and played that game. On his phone, Fatman was on speed dial, as were countless other gang members who he called to solve a problem or perhaps get out the vote for a friendly candidate. As Fatman stood outside, walking around in circles, the minister and I waited with Officer Reggie inside the steamy church. The phone rang. Once again, it was Melissa from the Housing Authority calling the minister. The minister made her an attractive offer. Listen, I'll take care of Fatman. He won't bother you for 30 days. I can't promise 45, but I can promise you 30. He won't shoot any more of your movers for 30 days, but you have to get his mama a subsidized apartment. It'll cost you a few bucks, but it'll be worth it. Sounds good? And Reggie and I will visit the landlord in the hospital to ask him not to call the cops. Sometimes it helps them to know that God is asking for the favor. And just like that, the landlord was taken care of. Lulu could move in without Fatman in her way. How would I have solved the problem? I remember thinking, when they tell you it's not about the money. Let me conclude. Every 50 years or so, great American cities will reinvent themselves. At times, it's a natural disaster that comes along, but a war or depression can also usher in this process of death and rebirth. In Chicago, so the saying goes, even the natural disasters are made by men. Men invented the city. From nook to cranny, immigrant laborers, guided by these risk-taking titans, converted a foggy, swampy cesspool into the quintessential American city. From the alleyways to the skyscrapers, Chicago has been brawny and stubborn and indomitable. It has always followed that lovely quote by Daniel Burnham in the lobby, "Make no small plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." At the dawn of the 21st century, Chicago's mettle was tested once again. The fate of its poor, living in projects and isolated pockets of poverty around the city demanded that Chicago respond. They needed a lease on life. And once again, Chicago answered with a big plan: tear down the projects. The same crisis was being repeated throughout America's large urban centers. Everyone was watching Chicago to see if government could really be smarter and leaner. It's been a gamble, like all markets are. On the downside, most families are living in racially segregated areas. They won't be coming back to the newly built areas. That's a myth if you think they do. We don't even know where most of them are. On the upside, some have shown improvement, good improvement. But anyone can throw around statistics, and I think that there's another story. I think a more helpful and important one. And that is that Chicago is at a crossroads. Will it show continued commitment to our social contract, the one in America that says that people should govern their lives? Us and them is no basis for a social contract. Figuring out how we can help them is pity. Figuring out what I'm doing that makes their life better or worse is the basis of a social bond. Like it or not, we're implicated in their misery. And what they are implicated in is a highly complicated marketplace, a truly free market in which everything is currency. If you can get Melissa at the CHA on the phone, you've got something to trade. If you can find a landlord who may ease up on the monthly rent or let you get free cable TV, you've got something to trade. If you can get Fatman not to recruit a kid into that gang, you've got something to trade. And everyone has something they can trade. And whether we like it or not, people like to feel like they have something to trade. If we wonder why the poor don't keep that menial job downtown or why they keep breaking the rules of welfare, food stamps, etc., it's because they're busy negotiating, bartering, cajoling, and otherwise building their self-esteem as people making markets do. When I move through poor neighborhoods, I don't meet people who want a handout, but I meet people who want to make things happen, who are inspired, who innovate, take risks, and so on. The stuff of Tuesday in Chicago. The Lulus of the world don't want government to solve their problems because the government doesn't even begin to understand their problems. This is why the Melissas and Carters and Minister Bookmans of the world are so magical. They all embrace pragmatism, that innovation, adaptive schemes that help people help themselves. Does it look like segregation, breaking the law, flouting the codes? Absolutely. But if we let bureaucratic rationality dictate how we create and implement social policy, we're doomed. There's a truth out there that's hard to accept. Most low-income families will stay poor, despite how much we help them, just as most wealthy people will stay wealthy. What do we do with that social fact? It's very uncomfortable, at least for me. And for these poor families, it is not crime or poverty that's the problem. Instead, it's the ability to respond to crime and the ability to cope with poverty. That's what matters. Who among us is without problems or challenges? Thank the good Lord for inventing a Visa card, or else I'd be dead. If people can't define their own problems and build their own solutions, then our charity may end up just punishing them. Our lofty principles and policies will choke them with unrealistic expectations. Yes, it may look like Lulus and Fatmans are treading water and living in the status quo, but the march to heaven, in this case, integrated crime-free neighborhoods, doesn't begin by telling the poor that they need to live like us. Watching from afar, I'm actually hopeful, particularly by Chicago's current mayor's approach to the city. He's been quiet, courageous, and innovative. Okay, maybe not so quiet. But what he seems to understand is that bureaucrats need discretion. We need to let cops, planners, directors figure out solutions, and everyone I meet says he respects the people by giving them a long leash. One way this administration seems able to do this is to realize that the power is in the community, in the brokers and mediators, in the problem solvers and the pragmatists who work behind the scenes. Like so many tenants, I miss public housing. I don't miss the poverty or the day-to-day misery that families live through, but I do miss the community that they kept. And I miss the fact that public housing was once the tallest and loudest sign that Chicago never forgot its poor, that they could have a view of the skyline, just like the lakefront liberals. Thank you very much for spending time with me tonight. Questions?
We have time for some questions and answers for Professor Venkatesh.
I got no answers. I'm out of answers. Questions I'll take.
Sudhir.
Yes.
When you talk about, I mean, this might be more of a simple question. When I think of CHA, I never really think about it as an institution. And when you're referring to landlords, can you help me understand like how I just considered that, you know, if someone was living in CHA housing, that their landlord was essentially like an office or a bureaucrat. Can you explain that to me? Like,
So by landlords, I mean a wide range of people that are compensated, in my story, for housing the families that are leaving public housing. They could be compensated with a Section 8 certificate that's run by the city, the state. I mean, there's all sorts of subsidies. So really the story for me that's so compelling is what happens when you change the landlords of the poor. That when they leave the CHA, in the sense of being living in places that have been managed by the housing authority for so long, and they move into the private market. What is that transition like? And I focus on one family, but I mean there are many families who are doing wonderfully, who are really enjoying that particular process. But culturally, it is a little different for people who have been used to a certain way of getting things done, and translating that and figuring out how to negotiate another set of bureaucracies, another set of rules. And that to me is a fascinating process I don't think we understand. And we don't really like to talk about it because it sounds very patronizing, right? Because then the words that we don't, then these words like culture start to come up, or intelligence, and that's not really it. It's not that they're not intelligent enough to do something. I moved from Chicago to New York. It took me 5 years to figure out how to order coffee because I thought I was calling everybody honey. Hi, hon, how you doing, hon? I expected people to do the same. I started doing that, they, wanted to put me in jail, right? You're not supposed to do that out there. They don't like you smiling too much. Maybe that had something to do with intelligence, I don't know. But in the same way, there's a set of translations that I think that I'm finding to be so important for how people get up and pick up and move to a new life. And these landlords are playing such an important role that we don't often pay attention to them. Right? We don't think about them because for most of us, they're people that we may engage with very, very rarely.
I was also troubled by your comment that there's a myth that the poor will stay poor and the rich will stay rich, or however it was stated. And I'm wondering if that's more true now than it would have been, say, 50 or 75 years ago, because there's certainly a lot of evidence that a lot of poor immigrants were able to advance themselves pretty significantly in our country over the last several decades. And it may be truer now, and I'm just wondering about if that is a fact, that there's sort of a convergence of not only the economics, but also the racial issue that is making your statement be more true.
Definitely truer that we have polarity in U.S. society, and that the distance of that the economic distance measured in quantitative terms from those who are the most wealthy and those who are the poor is growing. So that's one element. But the other element is that we are losing something I think that we have had in American society to some degree, which is a limited, modest kind of mobility that made it feel like you actually could be even more mobile. I don't mean the great Gatsbys of the world. I don't mean rags to riches stories. I mean you come back from the army and you buy a home. And that could make you feel like you're on top of the world. It may be a very small incremental change in your income. It may be a sign of stability that measured economically. You're nowhere near the Astors. But you're different than where you began. You're in a different place. And that kind of feeling that I'm in a different place after 5 years, that feels to me like we're not making that promise happen for people in this country. And that can be really dispiriting. So I don't think most people really want to be living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Believe me, I live very close to the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I don't like going over there at all. I think most people would enjoy a certain limited kind of growth and stability. And that I think we're failing to live up to our promise. I think there's a very bad.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I think my question really I want to know what your opinion is about the permeability that these people will have to go in and out of, like once they leave this very familiar, very large network that they've built for themselves, usually over generations. What do you think their permeability will be back into society in order to be successful?
The safe answer is that we don't know yet. And Professor Chaskin is sitting very close to you, and he could well give you all the data that you needed to figure out exactly what was happening recently in Chicago. We know that people are out. We know that they're coming back to some areas, and there's wonderful redevelopment taking place from the south side and the west side, north side. But there is another story that is harder to tell, and that's a story that started to come out in the early 2000s, where HUD and the CHA were getting into a little bit of a fracas, really, because the CHA was not keeping track of people. They were quite literally losing people, and they had to keep track of people. And so the HUD report started to say, you have a lost people problem. Right? This is the wonder of bureaucracy, right? What the heck does lost people mean, right? Where are they? What's happening to them? So there are a lot of people that have been purged from the system and who we don't know how they're faring. And in a city that has that kind of rich history that Chicago has, and a commitment, as people in this room know, to making sure that people don't get lost, that is troubling. It's troubling if we can't track the people that are on this program, that are moving and figuring out what they're doing. We don't know how big that is. We don't know how small that is. Part of the problem is that I talked a little bit about Lulu. Lulu's sister, Dory, had lived in an apartment in the CHA for 20 years. And the only thing that she had to do to live in that apartment was she paid Ms. Maple a few dollars a month, and she sent the CHA manager a few dollars a month, literally in an envelope. When demolition came time, after 20 years of living in this apartment, she was declared a non-leaseholder. She had no lease, so she couldn't get any services. She had to leave. Now, legally, the CHA is doing what it's supposed to do. It can't go serve people that are just coming in the door. But how do you deal with history like that in social policy? Well, that's a very difficult thing. How do you make up for it? Well, we're creating the same situation now, is my concern, is that when it doesn't go right year after year, you create problems that are very easily answerable by saying, legally I can't do anything. That was the past administration, et cetera. So that's a little bit of my worry today.
Well, thank you for your talk, which was extremely thought-provoking. I'm not a scholar who's done research like you have, so I just have the impressions I've gotten from watching the evening news that it seems like the displacement of people from public housing projects has been pretty much a complete disaster. Some people were accommodated like they were promised, but a lot of people, as you just referred to, were lost in the system. I think they've somehow migrated to the suburbs, where they've created new pockets of poverty in the suburbs, so that the problem wasn't really solved. It was just moved around. And also, I think the displacement of gangs to other areas has been a tremendously destabilizing occurrence for the city of Chicago. And a certain amount of the gang violence we have is turf wars with people who were displaced from Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor and so on. I guess I'm wondering if you know of any instance anywhere in the country where this kind of change in public housing from high-rises to scattered site housing has been successful. That would be interesting to know.
I'll give you a short answer and then a little bit longer one. The short answer is that there are many cities in which this is working well. The cities tend to be of smaller size than Chicago. Phoenix, Tucson, Seattle. There are places where, and then the high rises tend to be a little less high. So maybe 4 stories or down to 1 or something like that. Chicago's challenge is unlike anything, really. I mean, maybe Baltimore had that, maybe for very few. So the scale and the timing, 20,000 families pushed through the system and so fast is absolutely, it's who's going to do well? It's going to be very difficult in this market. Here's a different way of answering the question, which is, I don't know, I invite you to think about what would be the measure of success. When would we say this is successful, right? And before I get too much into data and measurement, et cetera, if I haven't put you to sleep, I'm going to put you to sleep already. Let me tell you. You can't hear me. Maybe they could turn this up a little bit. I'm happy to use whatever is that a little better? Yeah. Okay. Let me take another way at answering your question, and which is to ask you, what would it look like if this was successful? How would you know that this was working? When I first started doing this work, I met a woman who was one of these tenant leaders, and she would take me and she would try to help me to understand what life was like in public housing. And one of the first meetings she took me into was a room like this, where unfortunately there had been a drive-by shooting. It was an awful situation, bless you. There were, and 2 young children had been shot and were in the hospital. And the residents were outraged, as they well should be. And in the room there was all of these residents, and here there was a member of the city government, there was a police commander, and there were a few other officials. This woman, my host, came up to the front and she said, okay, well, the police commander has agreed to hear all of your issues and problems, so please go ahead and ask your questions. One of the residents shot her hand up and said, I have a question. The police commander said, yes, help me understand how I can make your community safer. Fix our streetlights. And the police commander said, okay, security. Maintenance is over here. That's with the city. Let's move on. The next person raised their hand. Pick up the litter. And me and a bunch of journalists in the back of the room are thinking, what is wrong? And you can imagine what we're really thinking. What is wrong with these people? That's the outside view. So I walk up to the woman who's the host of this meeting after that, and I say, why don't you get it? You're not talking about security. You have a chance to talk to the police commander, and you're bothering him with questions about litter? And I said, what is wrong with you? And she said, what is wrong with us? And I said, yeah, why don't you get it? And she said, oh, interesting. She said, why don't we take a little walk? I said, okay, we can take a walk. And she said, you may want to keep some notes on this because I'm going to give you a lecture. I said, fine. So I start walking, I'm writing, she's talking, she's telling me about things and such, and I'm writing it down. It's getting a little dark, and she's going a little fast. And I said, excuse me, can you just slow down for a second while I walk? She says, what's wrong? Well, I said, well, it's hard for me to write and see, et cetera. And then she said, well, I got to get home to make dinner. I'm going to take this shortcut. Let me just go through this alley here. She goes through this alley. I'm tripping on things I can't see. And finally I say, will you please slow down? She says, what's wrong? I said, I don't feel safe. And she said, why don't you feel safe? I said, well, I can't see anything, and there's trash all over the ground. She says, oh, you don't feel safe because it's not maintained very well. And then it just, I felt like an idiot. And the reason I say that is I am nervous to answer that question as much as I think of myself as a scientist and want to figure out, are people's income rising? Do they have a job? Are their kids in school? Are they doing better? All very important. I feel like I have to pay attention to how they're defining success and trying to understand what is important for them. Is it 6 months? Is it 1 year? Is it 10 years? Is it being able to be in touch with friends? And I don't think we pay attention to their voices enough. Sorry to go on at length, but that's another, I think, important part of this is just what would your measure be if you had all the data in the world? So.
Hi, my name is Pamela Barnes. I am a 1988 SSA alumni and a former student of Dr. Cafferty's. I am from the community of Harvey, which is in the south suburb. Mm-hmm. I left Chicago in 1994. I went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Berkeley, California, and I came back a few years ago. One of the things that's happened is 3 years ago, I got involved. I was invited to join my alumni high school foundation, which is Thornton High School. in Harvey, and Harvey is now a very different place than it was when I grew up. One of the things that has occurred is that there are many people from the Chicago public housing projects who now reside in the south suburbs. And so what has happened is that there is a greater concentration of poverty in that area. And what you were saying about like losing this sense of community, I see it in the families out there. And many of them, it's that they have in essence become more poorer. The other thing is that a number of families, it seems that they were once in the Chicago public housing system, that they transferred their vouchers to the South Suburban Housing Authority, because there's the Chicago Housing Authority and then there's the South Suburban, and so they transferred their vouchers there, and so that's one of the ways that they have migrated. But the communities like Harvey, Dalton, Calumet City, Country Club Hills, they're filled with a lot of people and those communities don't have the infrastructure that Chicago has, and it seems that most of the public housing developments came down after 2000, so that census money continued to come to the city of Chicago, whereas the people migrated out, moved to the south suburbs, and the south suburbs, did not receive the additional funds to support that population. The other thing, and I'll sit down, that I wanted to mention about the Chicago Housing Authority, I do know that there are a couple of property developers, managers. I know one is Leon Finney with the Woodlawn Organization, another is Elsie Higginbotham with Eastlake, and then Allison Davis's group, or his children have a group, and they manage, actually, or they did manage much of the public housing in Chicago.
I'm curious about your last statement when you said that when the projects were up, they were a reminder to you that Chicago never forgot its poor, because it generally struck me as quite the opposite, that it felt like a place that was where Chicago forgot about its poor, and that it was kind of set up that way in some ways, or after the fact certainly was created to become that. So I'm curious how you, having spent so much time there, how you had that view.
I think that's a good point. I think there's probably, hopefully, a kernel of truth, and I think there's a kernel of truth in both of those statements. You're absolutely right. To some degree, Chicago was let off the hook from doing anything meaningful for people because those homes existed. Maybe what I should have said is not that Chicago, maybe what I should have said is that Chicago, when those developments existed, Chicago couldn't forget about its poor. That doesn't mean it couldn't neglect its poor. It doesn't mean it couldn't poorly serve its poor, but it couldn't forget, it had to see them. Driving along that Dan Ryan, driving on the Kennedy, driving on the Eisenhower, you saw it every day. What we do as parents, as spouses, etc., with what we see is a whole different story. But when we see it, it registers. When it doesn't register, we then have a very difficult challenge, which is we have to create myths about it. And sometimes we create, and myths aren't false, it just means we create stories. And we're creating a lot of stories. And my feeling is that those stories serve us. They make us feel better about ourselves, which is what myths are supposed to do. But there's another part of myth, which is wonderful, which is that it connects us. And that's the part of the myth that I don't know if we're able to do, which is we don't know what's happening to people. And if you don't know, then it's difficult to form that kind of position of empathy and to be able to say, how you're faring matters to me. As long as I see those damn things, I know that, what the city is not doing its best. But if I say that the city is doing its best now, how do I know? That's all. Not that there aren't improvements that have been made.